Just make sure everybody's here. Seems like people are still coming in, Helen. Should we give it another minute? Okay, just as a heads up, as it's mental health today, and it's always good to see faces and familiar faces where possible. If everybody would like to put their cameras on, you don't have to, but it might make it a bit more engaging today if you decide to do so. Please put your cameras on if you don't mind.
The flow is slowed down now, so if you want to get going.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on our now monthly HR Lunch Club. We are delighted and very lucky today to be joined by Rachel Gilbert from Wirral Mind, which is a mental health charity on the Wirral, and we are going to obviously talk about mental health and particularly focusing on the impact that the sort of working from home has had on mental health. Obviously, as a sort of firm of solicitors and professionals where we work in an office environment, our apartment's massively affected by working from home, more or less gone from fully functional office to virtually the whole firm working from home more or less immediately from March. And with the now lockdown 2 that we're in, I certainly personally felt it was a bit of a blow mentally to sort of have to, you know, go back into lockdown, and obviously the more or the impact of working from home was certainly a bit more of a blow for me personally. I felt this time, although saying that I am actually at the office today for one reason or another. I'm just going to hand over to Rachel to sort of say hi and introduce herself, and then we'll get cracking.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Rachel Gilbert. I am the training manager for Wirral Mind, and I have been at Wirral Mind for nearly 6 years now. My background's actually in psychology, and since completing my undergrad degree in psychology, I've predominantly worked in adult mental health and try and bring all that wealth of experience into my role as training manager now. So Wirral Mind is a local independent mental health charity. We were established in 1967 to help people in our community achieve better mental health. We affiliate to the national charity Mind and therefore are part of a network of around 140 local Mind associations across England and Wales. And what you might find is that Wirral Mind might not actually be your closest one. But there's a whole map on National Mind's website to find where your local Mind is. And as such, we all provide slightly different services and resources depending on the local need and the local funding available. So for Wirral Mind, we provide a range of services, including our mental health resource centre. We've got a counselling service, a befriending service, and we have a range of training, including a community training programme, which is free and open to all. But we also have mental health in the workplace training and mental health first aid training as well. And whilst how we are able to provide our services currently might have changed ever so slightly, we are still here to help in any way that we can.
Thank you, Rachel. Right, so how it's going to work today, Steve Davies is also here from the employment team, and I'm going to do some introductory slides just to set out the background, a bit about the legal position, and then following that we're going to do a bit of a Q&A with questions that have been sent in by those who've signed up. So bear with me while I share my screen, hopefully. So there we go, so that's us and Rachel. Right, so good mental health. Well, the World Health Organization definition, which I'm pleased to hear from Rachel, is a commonly used definition in these sorts of seminars and training sessions. The definition of good mental health: a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. Well, coronavirus is extraordinary for many reasons, but one of the things that I've certainly found is that its ability to impact on everybody significantly for a variety of different reasons. And that could either be that, you know, they may be running a business and obviously the detrimental impact it's had. They may be concerned about their job, and then there's obviously the more personal aspects of it and how it's impacted the feeling of potential isolation if you don't have a support network or you're not able to access that support network, and obviously as well the sort of personal health concerns that it raises on top of the concern for perhaps children, vulnerable people, or older people who may require support, and obviously you could have concern about. So there's kind of two angles which I'm keen to focus on today. The first one being obviously those who do have disability and are a recognised Equality Act disability, and obviously we already know about our obligations to make reasonable adjustments for them and have regard for that disability if it's a mental health disability, and of course, you know, the potential risk of claims. But secondly, and perhaps more of a focus today, I think, is on the wider scope, not necessarily those who do actually meet the Equality Act definition of disability, but perhaps more suddenly have gone from going to an office every day or going to the usual work environment every day to suddenly being working from home and losing that sort of personal contact that they are familiar with. Okay, so obviously working from home in 2020, it's become the norm for a lot of people, when perhaps it was a more of an occasional thing to do. Some perhaps even regarded it a bit as a bit of a treat before. Certainly, I don't think that's the case anymore. So in the Office for National Statistics has found that in April 2020, 46.6 people did some work from home. And of those 46.6 people, 86% worked at home as a result of coronavirus. So you can see how significantly it has impacted on us all. And in a report from Nuffield Health, it was found that 80% of people who were working from home felt that it had a negative impact on them. So you can see how widely impacting it has been on for us all. As I say, whether you're whether you're Equality Act definition disabled or not. So why is it important for employers? Well, obviously a better, happier working environment, and one where there is focus on good mental health encourages productivity, good team morale, and that in turn generates goodwill and better brand reputation for our businesses. Many businesses will want to maintain that employees are their biggest asset, and we want them to be happy, we want them to feel comfortable, and they want them to be, in the best state of mind they can be in order to work well and work contently. The disadvantages, well, mental health is by far the most common reason that people are off sick, and Deloitte valued the cost to employers per year of 45 billion for those who are absent with mental health. So it's a significant impact on the economy, and therefore as employers we want to ensure that we do everything we can to promote good mental health and well-being, reduce sickness absences, and have a better workplace. Obviously, from an employer point of view, we don't want employment tribunal claims, better mental health workplaces, less claims, obviously, and of course the additional health and safety risk which we all need to be conscious of. There is relevant legislation in place, and employers should be keen to be aware of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Remember that where the workplace has extended to move from the usual place of work to home, then that Health and Safety at Work Act still applies to the home workplace, and where necessary, employers may have to do risk assessments and carry out, inspections of working workstations or where people are working to ensure that they are safe and they are in the environment. Now, often we'll be familiar with the sort of physical disabilities or physical adjustments that are required to help people. Perhaps they may need a special chair, special keyboard, special desks, things like that, supports in order to help them, sit at a desk for a long period or whatever. But don't forget that actual duty does extend to the mental health aspect as well, and we need to be conscious of that and offer support where we can. The Equality Act is something that we should all be familiar with as employers. Obviously, the definition of disability is something that has a material impact on the employee's or individual's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. As I've said earlier, today's focus isn't just on those who qualify for that definition. It's obviously a definition which is open to interpretation. Lots of the times we see disability discrimination claims where there is a dispute as to whether the employee actually is hitting the definition of disability in order for them to bring a claim, and that needs to be supported by medical evidence. And really, it does have to be a sort of recognised disability condition by a medical expert, and sort of beyond stress at work and things like that. But obviously, as people are off for longer periods, that can build up, and that therefore tipping them more likely into the definition. The claims of ones we'll be familiar with: disability discrimination. Often ones we see are discrimination arising from disability, and obviously the failure to make reasonable adjustments. Unfair dismissal, of course, if employer doesn't actually make the adjustments, doesn't actually do enough to ensure that mental health is being protected. Could we see a constructive dismissal claim where somebody resigns, says, it's impacting on my mental health so much that I cannot spend another moment there. And then we have victimization and harassment as well, which are the common claims that we may see. So some statistics for you before we open up in terms of the Q&A. 59% of organisations cite mental health among their top 3 causes of long-term absence. Well, I've said there that the Deloitte study earlier actually said that it was the most common. So you can see how impacting and important it is. 37% have seen an increase in stress-related absence this year. So you can see how corona is not only from the actual symptoms of coronavirus are causing absence, but also the mental impact as well. 60% reported an increase in common mental health conditions. I think the most common we see stress, anxiety, and depression. And the top 2 causes of that are heavy workload and management style, poor management style, people feeling that they can't express themselves properly because of the environment in which they work may not be conducive to talking about mental health. A third of employers have reported an increase in stress-related absence, and a third of organisations are now hopefully taking steps to address these concerns. And just finally, before we start the Q&A, I have actually got some slides which go after, which have some tips on for you to do that, but I didn't want to ruin the Q&A because some of those tips are already there. But if you can see the ACAS framework, the ACAS have produced this diagram, which I think is really, really good. And actually, it's not a bad idea to have that diagram visible to staff in workplaces or on intranets or however you share documents, because that sort of gives is it a Venn diagram, I think it's called, where you get the crossover and the importance of all 3 parties. So the manager, the business or the employer, the company, and the individuals sharing their mental health understandings and their positions, and then hopefully, working towards a better and more harmonious environment. Okay, so that was the brief summary and sort of mental health, but I'm now going to open up some questions which we've had from you. And firstly, for Rachel, what are the signs that an employee might be struggling with their mental health whilst working from home?
So in some ways, there's two parts to this question. There's general signs that we can look for, whether we are working from home or not. And I suppose the issue for people who are working from home is more about how you spot them if you are not seeing them on a more regular basis. So first of all, some of the signs that someone might be struggling with their mental health are they might look more tired, they might look upset, they may make little eye contact, you might notice that they are neglecting themselves a bit more, they might be quite quiet, distracted, withdrawn, confused, might become quite defensive sometimes. You might notice that their work is not at its usual standard, or somebody might repeatedly miss deadlines, for example. Not everyone may show signs that they are struggling, and one of the things that we talk about quite a lot in some of the training that we do, and some of the videos that we show within the training, is how much people how much energy people put into actually trying to hide the fact that they are struggling. So that's really important to kind of just notice and kind of be aware of. Really what you're doing is you're looking for any small changes in somebody's norm. So everybody's norm will be different, but what is that person's individual norm, and have there been any changes? It's about knowing your colleagues and your employees, and what they are like when they are well, and what their normal level of functioning is, and whether you have noticed any changes. I think some of the questions that we're going to come on to will pick up a little bit more on what we can do and how we manage some of those things whilst we're working from home. But I think it's about making that regular contact and just keeping in contact with people, checking in, not checking up.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I think that's quite a good phrase to remember, and actually leads us quite well onto the next question, which is for Steve. Steve, in terms of the employer, is there a duty on the employer, even where the employee doesn't have any obvious mental health signs?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. As you've already explained in the presentation, I think, by contrast to physical impairments, I think mental impairments can often be very difficult, or certainly more difficult to identify. And I think that puts an increased duty really on employers to think carefully about mental health issues, which, like I say, can often be invisible. And as we've seen, a number of mental health issues can amount to a disability under the Equality Act. Now, a common misconception is that employers that don't know an employee is disabled, employers that don't realise an employee is disabled, can't be liable, and that's not strictly true because of the way in which the Equality Act is worded. So under the Equality Act, yes, okay, an employer is not under a duty to make a reasonable adjustment if he or she doesn't know that the employee has a disability. However, the Equality Act goes on to say, or cannot reasonably be expected to have known that the employee has a disability. And this suggests, therefore, that the employer does have a duty to take steps to investigate whether or not the employee has a disability, even where it might not be obvious on the surface. Now, when disability discrimination first came into force, the original 1995 Disability Discrimination Act, early cases tended to suggest that the employer didn't need to take that much of a proactive approach in finding out whether the employee was disabled or not. But I think the trend now is that employment tribunals are much more likely to have higher expectations on employers, and must be able to show that they've done all they reasonably can be expected to do to find out if the employee has a disability, and if so, whether they need to make reasonable adjustments. So that might involve, for example, requesting medical records, referring the employee to occupational health, and asking important questions such as, Does the employee have a mental impairment? Which day-to-day activities are adversely affected? And is the effect likely to be long-term? So just in brief, I think the employer should be mindful of the possibility that an employee who is on sick leave or who is having difficulty participating at work, or showing some of those signs which Rachel mentioned earlier, even if it's not obvious why, they might still be disabled, and therefore the duty not to discriminate and to make reasonable adjustments might apply. So yes, there is a duty on an employer, even where the employee doesn't have any obvious signs of any mental health issues.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think probably what to take from that is if you're in doubt or you're unsure as to the extent of the condition, why someone's off sick or why someone is not performing, or then it's probably better to make the inquiries and sort of positively go and investigate, rather than try and think, oh well, if we don't investigate it any further, then hopefully then they won't fall into the definition and therefore we won't have a disability discrimination claim. I think that is definitely not the best way to deal with it, and that actually dealing with it head on is better, because you can't be criticised for even if that person ultimately doesn't meet the definition. You've done what you needed to do. Okay, so Rachel, if you have a member of staff who you're potentially concerned about, how do you think best for managers to sort of approach the subject? Obviously, it's not always the easiest conversation to have.
No, it's not always the easiest. First, I would encourage you to think about what you would need if you were struggling. People often talk about needing some time, reassurance, often being offered respect, to be listened to. Stigma-free attitudes are really, really important, and possibly some useful suggestions. Now, you don't have to be an expert to talk about mental health, but you can improve your knowledge and your confidence and make effective use of your time when you do have concerns. So in general, we talk about how spending 2 minutes giving really good attention is better than giving 10 minutes whilst you're thinking about everything else, or answering emails, or the phone's ringing, those sorts of things. If you are more distracted, you're not giving that good attention. So that's something really important to be noted. Don't be afraid to ask how someone is. Really ask them the question as well. How many times do we go through life saying, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Yeah, great. And then you've kind of crossed paths and gone, and there was no real sense of a conversation. It was more of a greeting rather than actually asking. If you are concerned, actually ask, and ask twice. We often talk about asking twice. No, really, how? Yeah, you'll get that normal response, but actually ask again. No, how are you? Are you okay? Can go a long way. It's really important to plan a time to address concerns, know where you're coming from, showing genuine concern and avoiding coming across as accusatory is really important as well. Use your skills to make people safe and comfortable. You can be very upfront but caring at the same time. They're not things that happen separately, they happen at the same time. And understand your obligations before you start, and I think that fits in with the employment law side of things. When you do approach someone, there's 3 things that we talk about in our training. We talk about when you approach somebody, note what you've observed. So I've noticed that you have been quiet recently. Is everything okay? So that would be one thing. State your concerns. I'm concerned that you're struggling at the moment. I'm concerned that you don't seem yourself. And then reassure and work with the person. So is there anything I can do to help? What would you like to happen? What support do you think may help? All of those little phrases, they're not coming across as accusatory. They are very much coming from a very supportive role within this. And I think if you can start the conversation off in that way, then you are opening up the door to have those conversations and making sure that you are there to support somebody. Yes, we have a job to do, and yes, we have a role to do, but you're going to get more out of somebody if they feel safe and comfortable and like you are coming from a supportive role. We can get them the help that they need, and therefore they are more able to do the job that you need them to do.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's excellent, and I think
apologies for the sound in the background. That was my husband leaving the house. I do apologise.
Right, classic working from home problem. I think one tip for managers or HR people who are having those conversations: perhaps keep a diary, even if it's just informal. Note the date, note the time. Ask, just checked in, see how they were. You cannot, and Steve and I will, tell you till we're blue in the face how important documents are in an employment tribunal. When we see disability discrimination claims for stress and anxiety, you always get allegations that they didn't do anything, they didn't check in with me, I was left on my own. And if you've got a diary that says, once a week I rang him and we discussed this, it's going to be so helpful in terms of the disclosure of documents and to protect the business from a claim. And also from the management of the mental health situation, keeping a log of how they're actually doing is if you've got a big team, or perhaps your HR and you don't necessarily know the person personally, well, how helpful is it going to be to have for you to be able to refer back to your diary of what this person's talked to you about, or whatever, for you to make sure that when you do actually speak to them, they do feel engaged. So yeah. Documents are always key, and simple scribbled down notes, even in a diary, will still be very useful. Okay, Steve. So if we have employees who don't recognise these signs, what's the risk?
Well, firstly, I think as we've seen, a failure to recognise those signs can obviously have a negative impact on the workplace. We've seen today that good mental health at work and good management go hand in hand. And there is strong evidence that workplaces with high levels of mental well-being are far more productive. So recognising the signs of poor mental health early and taking steps to improve the situation is clearly going to have a very positive effect for both the employer and the employee. But there are also legal consequences that we need to take into consideration as well, and they include, of course, as you mentioned in the presentation earlier, claims for disability discrimination and possibly unfair dismissal as well. And an employment tribunal can order employers to pay compensation for any money that the employers lost because of the discrimination, and that is uncapped in discrimination claims. They can also award compensation for any hurt or distress that the employee has suffered because of that discrimination, what we refer to in law as injury to feelings, and also a personal injury as well, for such things as stress and depression if that was caused by the discrimination. Obviously, it could result in expensive litigation, which can involve significant management time and legal costs, which aren't usually recoverable in employment tribunals. And of course, allegations of discrimination or harassment are likely to create bad publicity for the business also. So it's always better to avoid these sorts of claims and to manage the crisis than waiting obviously for a claim to be made. And as we've seen today as well, discrimination and harassment issues can be highly emotive, and the process can have a negative impact on staff and on the workplace as well. So there are quite significant consequences for the employer to take into consideration, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely a proactive approach is one that we'd recommend, and similar to in the past where we've had the Me Too movement, where there's a movement now for it not actually being possible to sign off confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure agreements where there's been sexual harassment in the workplace. The view being that if employers continue just to brush things under the carpet and pay people off who've been the victim of sexual harassment, then the world will never change. And I can actually see a not a dissimilar movement on this this type of problem, I suppose, workplace problem moving forwards, because if you've got someone who's off long-term sick, it's easy to think, well, could we do without them? But actually, should there be a more positive onus on the employer to actually investigate and do what they can to get them back to work? And I think that's far better, more beneficial for both the employer long-term and obviously the individual who's involved, rather than just being paid off to leave under some sort of compromised settlement agreement. Okay, so Rachel, so my point at the start was very much that there's a focus on not just those who are showing the signs, obvious or not, of perhaps equality at disability. So if you've got managers who aren't necessarily overly concerned about staff, but still want to sort of make sure they're okay, what can they do to make sure people will stay and keep motivated from home?
Yeah, so I suppose we've mentioned it already today, haven't we, that about having good mental health and positive mental health. And the fact is that we all have mental health and we need to look after it like we look after our physical health. I think most of us would agree we know what we should be doing to look after our physical health, but there's lots of things that we can do to look after our mental health as well. I think from an employer perspective, having open and honest conversations about looking after our mental health and the importance of it is really, really important and a really good first step. Remind people to be taking regular breaks, thinking about what they need as an individual to stay well, and thinking about how you can support them to do that, whether that be during work hours or reminding them about what they can do outside of working hours as well. So the usual things like getting good sleep, eating healthily, making time to relax, making time for you as an individual. Exercise is really important, both physically and mentally, and making time to do things that you enjoy and make you feel good. I think during the lockdowns, it's become even more paramount to build in really good self-care routines and to be able to plan and organise workloads better in terms of it was really easy, especially when the schools were shut, didn't have to get up to get my kids to school. It was really easy to roll out of bed and switch the laptop on and then sort out breakfast and things like that. Well, actually, during this second lockdown, what I found has been more helpful for me is still having that routine as though I was going into the office, getting up, getting washed, getting dressed, having breakfast, having that morning routine, and then switching on the laptop. I've had all that time to kind of just wake up and do what I need to do for me before then tackling what I've got to do that day at work. Really, really important. And I think that certainly was lost for a lot of people in that first lockdown, when those of us who hadn't worked from home before were suddenly found to be working from home. And I think having that opportunity to look at and to reflect on what we need as individuals is really, really important, and maybe open that up to having a conversation as a team if you think that that would be helpful. Shared learning is really important. It's really important as well to regularly check in with people, make sure that they're okay, whether there is anything they need, whether that be from a physical point of view or a mental health point of view or a workload point of view. All of those things are going to have an impact. And I've said it before, I think, I can't remember if it was while we were on the intros, but it's really important to check in with people, not check up on people. And there is a significant difference with that. And I think if you are coming from the right place, you are more likely to get more out of and keep people motivated to be working from home. And have a bit of fun with it. You know, are there things that you can do as a team to keep motivated? Is there something that you can do as a team? If you're normally within an office space and with more people, can you have a team check-in every now and then, or once a week? Or, you know, it's got to work for you as an organisation, but also as your team as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have tried to do a bit of exercise and things like that, haven't they, Rachel? I think even I've started running, which is an absolute miracle.
Well, even before we were on lockdown and thinking about the training that I did, you know, before lockdown, it's kind of the very distinct before and after, really, isn't there? We talked about in training about encouraging people to get up from their computers and have those mini breaks and take a walk around the block. There's no difference in that between that and working from home and doing the same. And I think actually having that time away from computers, if you have a predominantly office-based computer job, is really, really important, not only for you physically but also mentally.
Yeah, I think certainly moved away from it now, but I think historically the kind of the view on working from home was perhaps a bit that, you know, you sort of log in live from the telly, you know, watch the racing or the Masters on Thursday or whatever like that. And actually, I know my dad runs a construction company. That his attitude is absolutely, you know, you got to go to the office. That's the only place you do your work. And that's certainly not the case. And God, Steve and I have been absolutely swamped from working from home since March. And you know, but certainly that point that you made about waking up early, and you know, usually I'd normally drive to Chester and, you know, share a lift for somebody, and it takes us probably the best part of an hour to get in by the time we pick her up and we've walked into the office from where we parked, and we leave at 8 and we're here for 9. But actually, when you've had your breakfast by 8, you think, well, what am I going to do now? So I really should be logging in, and you're kind of conscious of the fact that you're not logged in. Airmans have been very flexible and sort of flexible around when we work, and basically do what you want as long as the work gets done has been pretty much the view provided the client service. And I think that approach from the employer is certainly helpful. But you don't have, and it certainly took me probably the best part of 3 or 4 months to actually sort of accept that I wasn't being, you know, watched in terms of when I was in at 9 o'clock and 5:30 log out or whatever. It was certainly the flexibility. It did take a time to actually adjust to that.
I think as well, if I can just add a little bit extra, sorry, Paul. I think there was something as well in there that you said, I feel like I should be doing something. And that is something that I think a lot of people, certainly feedback I've had, a lot of people have put a lot of expectations on themselves as well, that might differ from what their employers put on them, and finding that balance is really, really important. And just that maybe it's something to consider. We might get up at the same time, and yes, we might not have that usual commute, and well, what should we be doing? Well, maybe that is the time for you as an individual. Is that the time when you could do a quick exercise class, or go for a run, or go for a walk, or something else that you enjoy doing that makes you feel good, that sets you up positively for the rest of the day?
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Right, Steve, so should employers make their staff stick to strict working hours, or should a more flexible approach be taken? And if so, how should they do this, and what policies and procedures need to be in place for that?
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think the starting point there is that employers do have a duty, a legal duty, in fact, to consider flexible working requests. Now, flexible working is defined as a way of working that suits an employee's needs. For example, having a flexible start and finish times, or in fact, as we've been discussing today, working from home. So if the employee is struggling with mental health issues, then a more flexible approach can bring added benefits to both the employer and the employee, as we've seen in the examples that we've looked at today. So the employer should have a flexible working policy in place, which gives effect to this right that the employee has to request changes in their working arrangements. So employees who have worked for the employer for 26 weeks or more have this legal right to make this written request to change their existing working arrangements. And employers are obligated to deal with that request in a reasonable manner and to notify the employee of its decision. Now, dealing with the request in a reasonable manner would require the employer to assess the advantages and disadvantages of the application, to hold a meeting with the employee to discuss the request with them, and also to offer an appeal to the process as well. Now, if the request doesn't suit the employer's business, it is possible to refuse the request, as the employee's right is largely procedural. However, be careful, because employees may also have a remedy by way of other rights, as we've looked at before, such as under discrimination law. So in addition to a flexible working policy, I think it would be a good idea for employers also to have an equal opportunities policy as well. So a disabled person, a person with mental health impairments that makes a flexible working request, would also have additional rights under the Equality Act, and a failure by the employer to implement the request could amount to unlawful discrimination in certain circumstances, and also a failure to make reasonable adjustments as well. What sort of reasonable adjustments are we talking about? Remote working, obviously, adjusted hours and breaks to the working day, and flexible working, perhaps part-time working, and allowing flexi-time hours to allow disabled people to travel when it's safest for them to do so. So employers should consider flexible working requests carefully, and should also be mindful of their duty to make reasonable adjustments in certain circumstances as well.
Paul, you're on mute.
Sorry. So in terms of performance, and I think as managers, you know, performance is important. We might be getting it from above in terms of our staff in our team delivering. Solicitors, for example, we record our time, so we can show how much work we've done on particular files every day, and then we have targets in respect of that. But not every business is quite as easy to perhaps capture how work is done each and every day. Rachel, how can managers with staff who are at home balance that performance against the sort of difficulties and of working from home that we've suddenly been placed upon us?
Yeah, I think, again, it's about having open and honest conversations with people. Acknowledge that this is difficult if it's not something that you're used to doing, that it has its difficulties, and talk through those difficulties, you know, as adults. I think is really important to acknowledge. And encourage anyone who is struggling to get in touch and have that conversation. Because if you're not aware of it, and if you don't know it, and it becomes a performance issue, then that's when you can end up with more difficulties. It's again going back to that point about making people feel safe and comfortable. About trying not to come across as accusatory. I realise that there is still a job to do, and that, you know, there are things that we need to achieve within our roles, and I suppose that there's that acknowledgement that there needs to be that little bit of give and take at the moment, whilst people are trying to come to terms with working from home and the difficulties that has raised. It's about working with them to come to some sort of an agreement, as we would do if we were in the office. It's about creating a culture that enables disclosure and encourages disclosure as a positive process, rather than having an action plan and disciplinaries and things like that. We might need to go down that road, but if we can start off with that kind of developing that culture where mental health is talked about more and enables that disclosure and is a positive process and is seen as a positive process, that goes further in enabling those conversations. And providing strong leadership with open, clear cultures which value staff is a really, really good starting point as well. And I suppose it's finding that balance, isn't it, between what our policies and procedures say and what our process is in terms of performance management, and using our common sense and our human nature to have those conversations to support people whilst they are at home, and whilst there might be those added difficulties.
Yeah, I think it's about knowing your staff, knowing how different people might react to different questions, and sort of tailoring it, isn't it, to the needs of the individual, and not just treating everybody the same, I suppose, and not having, you know, this is your what you've got to do, and just get on and do it. Don't care how it's done, just do it. You've got to tailor it to everybody's needs.
And that's no different to being in the office, really.
No, exactly.
And I think it's about finding that balance between how we support somebody and kind of that human nature aspect, and thinking about how and what those impacts have been in terms of working from home and working together to come to some agreement and to work through those issues.
Okay, Thanks. Right, Steve. So working from home for many now is the norm, or at least partly the norm. I think for many of us, I mean, it's a lot of people are of the view now that we might not actually fully ever return to fully functioning offices as we once knew them ever. Is there a point where working from home could be considered a permanent change to the place of work within the employment contract? And would an employee's rights change if that happened? And would we need to notify insurers?
I think thanks, Paul. I think it's a really interesting question. And I haven't seen that much discussion of this or consideration of this question, actually, during this COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's going back to basics, really. And in addition to the express terms contained within a written contract of employment, which usually obviously sets out where the employee is required to work, which is very often, in the office, it's important to remember that a term can also be implied into a contract of employment by virtue of custom and practice, so even if it's not sort of expressly stated. And many people here today might be aware of this with bonus payments. So, for example, even if the contract is silent as to bonus payments, if an employer pays a bonus on a yearly basis, there could therefore then be an expectation that forms part of the contract, and very often employees will bring claims even though there's not an express contractual term to a bonus payment, and they can be successful because by custom and practice there is an implied term. Now, a factor determining whether this is possible or not could be whether the practice has been followed without exception for a substantial period of time, and the longer the period of time, I think the more likely it is to become a term of the contract. So that bonus payment is paid year after year after year for a substantial period of time, then that expectation is there that it's an implied term of the contract. Now, to my mind, on the same principles, I think it is possible in the future that working from home could become an implied term of the contract by custom and practice, especially, like I say, if it's been allowed without exception and for a substantial period of time. Now, again, my own view is, at this stage of the COVID-19 pandemic, for most employees, it might prove difficult for them to argue that home working has become an implied term of their contract by custom and practice. And this is because for most employers, it's clearly a temporary measure at this stage as a result of government rules or government guidance. However, like you said before, Paul, when you asked the question, employers are reporting now that home working is working well, and employers might want to continue the practice even when it's safe for employees to return to the workplace. And I think if this proves to be the case, then employers continue to allow employees to work from home. And I think it's certainly arguable that an employee could have an implied term to work from home, even if their contract of employment states otherwise. So it would be very, very interesting to see what the employment tribunal make of that. And of course, in these circumstances, it would be prudent for the employer to keep their employer liability insurers abreast of the situation, I think, as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we want to make sure, and obviously because the terms of that policy could be that you've got to tell them, and obviously the workplace has got to be maintained to a certain standard and stuff like that. So you may actually have a positive duty to tell them anyway. So it might actually be worth digging out your policies and checking if you do need to notify of people, particularly if there is a fundamental change to the contract. I think almost certainly. Yeah. Right, Rachel, last one for you. Are there any practical tips you can suggest for employers to engage with staff working from home? I think most people are sick to death of quizzes, although the general knowledge of this country must be extraordinary now, having all those quizzes we did in lockdown 1. Any other tips?
I don't think I did any quizzes. I'm up for a quiz if anybody wants to involve me. I'm up for one.
As the resident Aaron Partners quizmaster, I'm not interested in doing another one.
Fair enough. Noted. Okay, so I think we've covered a few little hints and tips, but I will repeat them anyway. I think sending messages and checking in with people on a regular basis is really, really important. It helps us to reduce that feeling of isolation and loneliness, and as human beings we need that social interaction, and so working from home on our own has caused us all sorts of different stresses in that way as well. Perhaps having a weekly team Zoom for half an hour, even if it's just to have a cup of tea and a chat. Doesn't have to be particularly work related or quiz related in any way, but just allowing that opportunity to have a catch up. Most of us who are used to working in offices would generally have that ability to go and make a cup of tea and have a chat with somebody, and we've kind of lost that during working from home and things like that. So can we introduce something like that to encourage those little catch-ups and things like that? Again, it's about getting team leaders or managers or however your organisation is structured to support lunch breaks and sensible working hours. Really, really important. I think because those lines become so blurred, it's about leading by example, and making sure that your staff teams are having those breaks, working sensible hours. Check in if you're still receiving emails at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. Is there a reason for that? Is it because they've taken some time out earlier in the day? Well, okay, but actually that then impacts on our good sleep routine. Promote open dialogue and involve staff in decision making. Again, I think that's really, really important. The more that we feel involved, we are feeling less isolated, we are still feeling part of the team, is really important. Promoting physical and social activities. Okay, so some of those have been impacted a little bit with lockdowns and working from home and things like that, but under the guidelines as they are at the moment, are there things that we can do to promote some of those activities? And when it's safe to do so, can we go for a walk? And can we a couple of us go for a walk if we don't live too far from each other? Again, it's about reducing that isolation, being included within that kind of team environment for those of us that work in teams. And again, it's really important to invest in staff, encourage learning, encourage development. That doesn't need to stop just because we are working from home. It might be actually that we can encourage that even more. That extra half hour that we're not using to commute could be your half hour to learn something new, or be your development time for you. That's half an hour every day. That's 2.5 hours every working week if we work a 5-day week. That's not insignificant. It's about being proactive and thinking about how we can use our time effectively. And I hope that that's been useful in some ways. I think it's about thinking outside the box, and looking at what we can do to encourage our staff and engage with our staff. And it's about what works for you. Be flexible, talk to the team, involve the team. How do they want to be engaged by you? And see where you get to.
Thanks, Rachel. That's certainly some really good tips there, and we have got some bullet points which will go out on the slides, which you can by all means have. Steve, finally, I think it's almost certainty we're going to see some more tribunal claims, to say the least. Figures announced, I think yesterday, said there's more than 300,000 people been made redundant already. But with a specific sort of thought of mental health, do you think after the pandemic ends, hopefully Boris has got his vaccine, might not be the too distant future, that we will see a surge in tribunal claims connected to mental health? It's obviously something we have been seeing more frequently over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, to say, but
yeah, and I think this is certainly going to exacerbate that, isn't it? I mean, it's never possible to see into the future, of course, but I mean, we are beginning to see claims, aren't we? And I think what's really significant is that the Equality and Human Rights Commission have come out recently and warned that employers may face a raft of discrimination claims. That's how they've termed it, if they unfairly treat disabled members of staff during or as a result of the coronavirus crisis. And in preparation for that, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they've also issued some new guides as well, and I'd urge you to have a look at the guides. They're on the Equality and Human Rights website, and they give details of organisations' duties to make reasonable adjustments, and we've looked at some of those requirements today, haven't we, in relation to disabled employees. The guides also set out employers' legal responsibilities to help employees correct and make lawful decisions around dismissing and furloughing disabled staff in this climate as well. So I think it's significant that, like I say, they've made that statement that employers may face a raft of discrimination claims. We've started to see, or I certainly have started to see claims coming through. So I think it's important that employers are attuned to that, really. So yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Great, yeah. Well, at least we've all worked for you and me, Steve. Just there is one question in the chat, only one. So if you have got anything, we've got about 4 minutes left. It's probably more appropriate for Rachel. There's a question from Shell here, which is that where you have a situation with an employee who you're trying to approach and their response isn't particularly, you know, they're not really willing to engage to talk about it. They say it's private to them, and you know they don't want to talk about it, and actually perhaps even beyond that become a bit confrontational about it. How would you think would be a good way of dealing with that, Rachel?
So I think this is it's a little bit difficult in terms of how to answer this. In some ways, if somebody is not at that point where they are acknowledging to themselves that there's an issue, or that they're struggling with anything, or that they don't particularly see that, it's very difficult to actually engage with somebody, and somebody will only want to talk about it if they want to, or they will only talk about it if they want to, and that is quite difficult. And I understand that sometimes that can lead, I've pulled up the chat, it talks about it can lead to disruption and things. Well, there's two very different kind of areas there, isn't there? One, there is allowing somebody the time and space and knowledge that they can come to you if they want to talk about it. But then there's also the flip side of that in terms of managing the team generally. It is a difficult one. I suppose as a manager, you still need to manage that kind of those team dynamics and things like that. And I think in terms of the mental health side of things, it's just about saying, look, I'm here if you want to talk. I'm concerned. You obviously don't want to talk about that at the moment, and that is okay, but just know that I am here. However, then thinking about how to manage that other side of things, it's maybe about having that conversation of the conversations that you are having are now disrupting the team and the team dynamics, and where you don't want to talk about it now, that's fine. I don't mind, you know, you come to me when you feel able to and want to talk about it. However, please note that the conversations that you are having are disrupting the team. And, you know, is there a way of, it's a really difficult conversation to have, isn't it? Because you don't want to offend somebody, but and Absolutely. It's finding that balance between not offending them, managing the situation, and also trying to offer them support and know that you are there to support them when they are able to. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
Yeah, it was quite a trick. Okay. Well, there you go. Shell said she's given it.
Thank you, Shell.
I think Shell, the only thing I would follow on to say is make sure you're documenting all of the conversations that you're having. Perhaps think about something like a mediation. You can get independent mediators externally to come in to talk about, you know, try and resolve it, either whether it's around the table or someone going back and forth between different rooms. Some contracts of employment have actual contractual clauses if it's person's off sick, which requires the person to actually engage in the process, and if they don't, they may go down to SSP. That's something that can be in employment contracts from time to time that you see. So we have unfortunately run out of time. That was well, I thought it was brilliant. I think the check-in, not check-up sort of catchphrases, something that I'll certainly take away from that. I thought was is really helpful. So thank you very much, Rachel. That was really helpful. If anybody would like Rachel's details, just drop me an email or Steve, and we can pass them on to you. Obviously, Wirral Mind are someone who can do training and things like that for employers. So just get in touch if you need to, and obviously if there's any follow-up questions, then feel free to ask. Okay, well, I hope everybody's keeping well, and we'll hopefully see you at the next lunch club in December. All right, bye everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.